First of all, I'd like to thank the James Connolly 1960 Society of Monaghan for the invitation to speak here at this memorial to Ben Murray, volunteer in the International Brigades in Spain who died fighting fascism. As we stand here at this memorial to Ben Murray, we should recall that this memorial is here because of the foresight and determination of our late friend and comrade Eddie O'Neill, who has left our ranks. We remember Eddie's contribution not just to building many such memorials around the country to those who left our country to travel to Spain to defend the working people of Spain and the Spanish Republican democracy, but also to remember Eddie's contribution to the struggle against British imperialism here in Ireland. Today, the peoples and nations of Europe, and indeed the wider world, are closer to a global war than at any time since 1962. The two largest countries in Europe are at war. The immediate cause was the invasion by Russia of the Ukraine. But we as revolutionaries must look deeper at the events that led up to this war. What lies at the heart of this situation is the expansion of NATO and its project to constrict its imperial competitor Russia by establishing large bases of troops and mass destructive weapons along its western seas and southern borders, and the massive arming and training of Ukraine forces and paramilitaries, especially by the British. The situation is aggravated by the fact that overt fascism is well ensconced in the political system in Ukraine and in its military. We need to understand these events and the role of imperialism in these events that are unfolding, and draw upon our own lived experience of the role and nature of imperialist power and the interference here in our own country. We should know from bitter experience that British imperialism has a very casual relationship to truth and to justice. We should recognise crocodile tears when we see them from the imperialist forces for the suffering of the Ukraine people. When we hear Johnson and Biden speak, forces death to them and blind to the suffering of the heroic Palestinian people and to the mass murder of the people of Yemen. Forces that have blockaded revolutionary Cuba for over 6 decades. Imperialist forces that have overthrown left and radical governments, that have sanctioned nations and peoples, that have who had the audacity to stand up for their sovereignty and independence, who simply want to build a better future, a better society for themselves and for future generations. We should recognise the hypocrisy of the Irish establishment, figures such as Micheál Martin or Leo Varadkar and their ilk, when they turned a blind eye to 6 decades of violence and repression of the nationalist people in the 6 counties. We should recognise the double standards of what calls itself the free press in this country, which ignored what was happening in the 6 counties for decades, which turned a blind eye to the British state-directed killings of ordinary nationalists as well as political opponents and active Republicans. Ben Murray was an Irish communist, an anti-fascist who lived and who died fighting fascism on the heroic banks of the Ebro River. Ben was only 15 when he emigrated to Canada. Like millions of other young Irish men and women, he was caught up in the First World War fighting in the Canadian Army. He fought with the Canadian Army, a war for the ruling classes of Europe, and particularly the British ruling class liked to portray that war as some sort of heroic struggle for freedom and independence of small nations, to cover up what really was about a barbaric inter-imperialist slaughter, a war to carve up the world between the victorious imperialist powers. We witnessed this growing whitewashing of that barbarism here in Ireland as the Shawneen establishment continued to ingratiate themselves with the British with their shams shared history. Even some former Republicans have recently increasingly fallen for such nonsense. All part of the process of involving the Irish people in increased militarism, closer links with NATO and a greater military cooperation and cohesion of the European Union. Ben Murray was made of better stuff. He absorbed the experience of his own people. He understood what he had and what was taking place in Ireland as well as abroad. He had the strength of character to see beyond the lies and propaganda. He came to the conclusion that we needed a better world, a better way of organising society, a better society for working people. He believed in democracy in its fullest sense, not the narrow concept of getting an opportunity to put a tick beside a name every few years and then be told to stand back and leave the important decisions up to those who know best. No, Ben Murray believed in much more radical democracy, one that embraces all aspects of the people's lives. He believed in economic democracy, where those who created the wealth, working people, should own and control all wealth in society, the wealth they produced, that the natural wealth provided by nature should belong to all. He believed democracy should apply in all spheres of people's lives: economic, political, social, culture. Those high ideals are those who went to Spain 86 years ago should be the anchor that guides our actions today. A better world can only be achieved by the active struggle of working people today. All of us standing here today to pay tribute to people like Ben Murray believe in a united Ireland, as Ben did. But we have to ask ourselves, what type of united Ireland do we want? Do we want a united Ireland controlled by rack-renting landlordism, both Irish and transnational banking capital? Do we want a united Ireland of low pay, precarious work, no security for what tomorrow will bring to your door? Is the united Ireland we want one in which old people are afraid to turn on the heating to warm their homes, or haven't enough money to buy the necessities of life, where their care is driven by the profit motive? Do we want a united Ireland of poor health services and growing waiting lists, a health service controlled by private medical interests, insurance companies and the global health corporations? Do we want a united Ireland where our children still have to immigrate to find work, to find a future? A united Ireland where we all carry the same passport as we board a ship or plane looking for the future somewhere else, still having to leave behind family, friends and broken communities? Is the united Ireland we want or struggling for one of more of the same? Some peddle the nonsense of parity of esteem. We have to ask, when have working people been treated with esteem or respect in this country, north or south of the British border? Partition has failed. We have a century of experience to show that has failed the majority of our people. A tiny rich minority have done well, thank you. The current internal state settlement has failed. A Stormont stumbles and staggers, only sustained by drip feed of British money. The executive is lit more than a gravy train, dispensing largesse to its friends and supporters, further exacerbating sectarianism and division. The British pacification process has succeeded in drawing many of its former opponents into managing that pacification process. We know that they use British resources to marginalise those they disagree with, to control funding, to secure political loyalty, to manufacture the required outcome, an outcome that only reinforces imperialist domination and control. This same process operates within this state, as we witness daily the abandonment of long-held principles by some too eager to allow to sit around the table, the government table, and to divvy up the spoils. I don't believe we would be following the footsteps and remaining true to the ideals of Tone, Pearse, Connolly or Mellows if we accepted or curtailed our demands to simply a united Ireland if nothing changed for working people, if we accept that the continuation of this bankrupt and humane system. Here we need to recall the words of James Connolly, written over a century ago, which still remain true today, and I quote, "Ireland without her people is nothing to me, and the man who is bubbling over with love and enthusiasm for Ireland and yet can pass unmoved through our streets and witness all the wrong and suffering, shame and degradation wrought upon the people of Ireland, aye, wrought by Irish men upon Irish men and women, without burning to end it, in my opinion, is a fraud and a liar in his heart, no matter how he loved the combination of chemical elements which he pleased to call Ireland." End of quote. Connolly and Pearse were not pursuing a romantic ideal of an abstract political theory. The demand for real democratic control in a sovereign, independent Irish Republic was the practical and only means to secure the needs and interests of the people of Ireland. For them, as it should be for us, political and economic freedom are inseparable. One cannot be achieved without the other. The basic principles must guide our actions and shape our demands. The united Ireland of tomorrow will be shaped and built by the demands we raised and the struggles and resistance we organise today. We have to offer our people more than vague promises of maybe something better. We have to turn a vague aspiration of a united Ireland into concrete forms of struggle. We have to turn to Connolly and grasp the fundamental question: the unbreakable link between the national content of the class struggle and the class content of the national struggle. I would recommend all gathered today to get a copy of the democratic programme for a new Ireland, adopted and published by the Father O'Donnell Social Republican Forum to mark the centenary of the first democratic programme of over a century ago. I believe it is a good guide to action and presents a vision of a different Ireland for all of us to work towards. The central core of that strategy must be bringing people, working people, into power. That is the legacy of Ben Murray and his comrades left to fulfil, as has the late Eddie O'Neill. Now is not the time for despondency or carrying on as usual without learning from past struggles, not to retreat into old ways of thinking. Ben Murray and Eddie O'Neill believed a better world was necessary and a better world was possible, a socialist Ireland. We need to organise ourselves to bring that about. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Eugene.